So looking at the process of strategy and formulation, we look at we have 7 steps when you talk about formulating a strategy. The first one is assessment of the external environment. Now, in assessing the external environment, basically you want to look at the political, the economic, the social, the technological, the legal, and of course the environment in itself. Now, understanding that what you're trying to do is that you're trying to find information in line with the research that you have conducted. Again, having internet goes a long way in saving us a lot of cost and hassles in terms of acquiring this information. As I've said again, 20 years ago, 50 years ago, you'd have to basically get a consultancy firm. They'll design, put together or assess the environment for you, put together a report, or should I say collate data and then put together a report that helps you to make an informed decision. Nowadays, that can be done at the tip of your fingers, whereby you have internet, you have access to information. And this information, though of course some not all correct, but a lot is, once you know where you're sourcing it from. And this information is used as data to then help you to make the informed decision. Now, understanding that, also you have to understand that with the overall macro environment, which I just discussed, we also have what we call the micro environment. Now, the micro environment, this is where you find the industries. Now, if you recall, I talked to you about Dangote, and I told you that Dangote has different businesses, and each business is found in different industries, meaning the dynamics of that businesses differ. The dynamics of the type of suppliers, the pattern of how the customers buy the product, the way the market entry of that industry all differs. Now, in understanding that, what you have to understand is that you have to assess each and every microenvironment because they are different in nature. And that is why we talk about having business strategy in itself, because you're knowing that the dynamics of each industry differs. And this is what we call the micro environment. And some call it the market environment in itself. So the second stage of formulation is assessment of the internal environment. The internal environment is where you look at the organization in itself within and what is available to it, meaning the resources, the human resources, the raw materials, and everything else, infrastructure and everything else that is inclusive within that organization. But then also, you're trying to look at, if you can recall, I talked about distinct capabilities. Again, the combination of these resources and the capabilities that is able to give an organization towards having a competitive edge or a competitive advantage. So assessing this, the internal environment and understanding the strengths of the organization, and then of course, more importantly, understanding the weaknesses and how to improve on that becomes essential towards achieving that. The third step here is the assessment of the values of top managers and stakeholders. That's establishing the common values, meaning that we have to make sure that the values at the end of the day become the common values of the organization, meaning that they align, and making sure that everybody's on one page on exactly what needs to be achieved in the organization. Now, assessing these values and then bringing about together a consensus of what these values are is essential towards achieving the strategic, that's the strategy of the organization. The fourth step here is matching the external, internal, and value analysis. Meaning at the end of the day, you want to make sure that the dynamics of what exists within the external, the internal, and the values of both the stakeholders and the managers are aligned together. And it's meaning that everything is possible. There's nothing that's going to hinder it, because at the end of the day, you're able to see an alignment of all the 3 factors that I've just mentioned. Then the fourth stage is formulating the long-term or strategic objectives. So once you're able to know the dynamics of these 3 factors I just mentioned, which again, as I said, is the external, internal, and then the values, at the end of the day, you want to make sure that at the end of the day, you're able to provide a strategic objective that works. Now, here, when we talk about objectives, we have to understand that for any objective, it has to be what we call SMART. Now, a SMART objectives, basically what we're trying to say is that for you to formulate an effective objectives that is towards achieving what that strategy is, you have to make sure that it's specific to exactly what it is that you're trying to achieve. That's the S. It is measurable, whereby you're able to have a measure, so that at the end of the day, you're able to put together a control or monitoring and control mechanism towards making sure you're reaching the milestones that you have set as a measure or a standard of value. Then it has to be, of course, achievable. Now, this is where you talk about the resources you have available. You can only achieve something if you have the resources available. And that's why we talked about the alignment of the strategy, with the environment, the external and the internal environment, and of course the values. So it's only something that is achievable. And then the fourth one is realistic. It has to be realistic. Remember, I'm spelling SMART here. The S, specific, the M, measurable, the A is achievable, then R is realistic. Now, realistic here, we're just trying to say that at the end of the day, whatever objectives you set, meaning the strategic objectives, it has to be something that you know your organization has the capability and ability to achieve within the stipulated time, which goes to the last aspect of the SMART, which is T, time, which is has to be time bound. So the T means time bound. So it has to be something that's within the time, that has a time frame, so that at the end of the day, you know when it needs to be achieved, you know the level that needs to be achieved and when that level should be achieved. And in that way, it gives you a framework towards how you're going to achieve that. So again, you have to formulate that long-term or strategic objectives in line with these factors that I just mentioned, which is the SMART objectives, as we call it. Then sixthly, which is the sixth step here, is identify and appraise all possible strategies with which the organization can pursue formulated objectives. Now, recall, I haven't mentioned this, but there are different types of strategies. We have different types of strategies, which we're not going to go into this particular session, but just to list some of them, as I said, we have acquisition strategy, or what we call joint venture. Then we also have what we call diversification. We have research and development, or research development strategy. We have backward integration. We have forward integration, product development, market penetration. So all these strategies at the end of the day varies in terms of how you go about in the series of actions towards achieving the objectives. But again, knowing that in line with what the dynamics are in your environment, you could have different strategies that you want to pursue. Again, you have to have different alternatives of what strategies you want to pursue, and understanding the reality of how these things work. Usually you have a group of people or a set of people that sit down and decide on what strategy to go towards achieving the objective. So you would have different strategies that everybody would decide would work for the organization, depending on the dynamics of the organization. So understanding that, that's why we have that sixth step, which is identify and appraise all possible strategies. So looking at the list of strategies, you have to appraise them and look at which one will work best for the dynamics in which you find yourself in the organization. And all right, then the seventh step is identify and make a feasible choice out of the strategic alternatives. So how do you make a feasible choice? Now, this is where it can get very watery for a lot of people, because how do you decide on the best course of action? And how do you know which one will suit the organization best? Now, for organizations, of course, a lot of organizations, to sit down and maybe you'd have the CEO or the manager that would decide, okay, this is the strategy we want. But for a proper strategy formulation, it's essential that you find a non-biased way of trying to select a strategy. And what we use is that we use weighted averages in terms of what works best in line with some of the dynamics or choice in strategy that we discussed earlier on. So for example, if we're trying to choose between a strategy of diversification, for example, or we're trying to look at backward integration, and we know we have limited resources, we can't do both, it would be nice to do both, but it's not possible because of the limited resources. So understanding that, how do we decide on which strategy will work best for the organization? And this is where you have to then look at the different, in line with the strategic choice that I gave you, the list of strategic choices. You have to then look at what strategy will work in line best, or which one will have more advantage in line with some of these factors that I mentioned when I mentioned strategic choice. And knowing which strategy, looking at both hand in hand, you're able to compare and contrast, and at the end of the day, you're going to get a more objective solution in terms of that, whereby it is not biased, it is not decided by emotions or somebody's opinion or assumption. Is more using at the facts, looking at all the dynamics of what you have collected in terms of the external, the internal, the values. We talked about also the background of the organization, what that looks like, and then the dynamics of the environment. All that plays a role in deciding at the end of the day which strategy will work best for the organization. And through that, you're able to make a feasible choice. And that's why we say it's feasible, something that will work best for the organization. You're also going to consider the cost of that strategy. That's also a very big reason for your choice of strategy. So how much will it cost? Do we have the means to do that? Do we have the capabilities to do that? In line with the environment that we find ourselves, would that strategy work best? So you're going to weigh all this and then decide on the best course of action. So with that, we're also going to look at the criteria for assessing strategic alternatives. So according to Hills and Jones, all relevant and feasible strategic alternatives of a corporate entity should be judged against some identifiable criteria. And what are these criteria? They are 5 in number. So appropriateness to the available resources, which I just mentioned now. Do you have the resources required to select the particular strategy that you want to select? Or if you have different alternatives, what are the resources available among these alternative strategies, and which one will work best with these resources available? Number 2, the appropriate time horizon. There's always a time period in which you want to execute an action or the strategy. So the time that you have available, and the time horizon, of course, is dependent on so many things. It could even be as complicated as the regime that exists within a society. So if I know I have to achieve something within Tinubu's regime, then of course I have to make sure that I have to be considered the time horizon, and if the strategy that I want to execute can be done within that time frame. Again, it could be the economics in terms of the economy and how the economy is in terms of the volatile economy that we find ourselves, and considering that the trends that exist within that time frame, depending on what industry you find yourself. All this will be considered in terms of the time horizon. Then you have the internal consistency. Now, the internal consistency is talking about back to your capability, but then also what you're able to do, what you're able to continue doing within your organization in line with the resources that you have available to yourself. So your internal consistency and your ability, meaning your strength and your ability to keep to that, is very essential towards deciding on which particular strategy you want to go for. So you wouldn't want something that, and then it goes back to what we talk about sustainability. You don't want to start something that you can't continue. Then you talk about the external consistency. Again, in line with what I mentioned, the time horizon, knowing what is available within the dynamics of the external environment that you find yourself, and making sure that the consistency of how long that will last is essential towards making you decide on what strategy will work best for your organization. And then finally, the acceptable degree of risk. So how risky is the strategy that you want to execute? And at the end of the day, what's the cost benefit analysis of that strategy that you want to execute, or looking at the different strategies that you want to execute? So what's the cost benefit of those strategies? And then finding the one that has the least risk. Though some people tell you the higher the risk, the higher the return. But again, it's a balance between the cost and benefit that one has to outweigh to then determine what will work best. So with that, we're going to stop here, and I hope to see you for the next session.